There are some buildings where the dead do not feel far away. It's not like in old cemeteries, abandoned houses, or old battlefields. These are places where the lights never fully go out, where someone is always awake, where machines beep in the dark, carts roll down empty hallways, and call lights blink outside rooms where no one is supposed to be. Hospitals, nursing homes, long-term care facilities. Ask a night shift nurse, a CNA, or a hospice worker. They will tell you that strange things happen in these places that just can't be explained. Maybe the most creepy part about these stories are that they're not loud or dramatic. They're not doors flying open or objects being thrown across the room. These are more subtle. And in places where people are constantly moving from life into death, you have to wonder, are these buildings haunted? Or are they simply places where the veil has worn thin from so many goodbyes? Today, we're opening up the case file on haunted hospitals and nursing homes. Hey friends, welcome back to the Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new here, we're so glad to have you. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something, but I don't want to admit it moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about it. When we talk about haunted hospitals and nursing homes, we're not just talking about spooky buildings. We're talking about places where people healed, sometimes suffered, places where people waited, and places where families said goodbye. It should come as no surprise that medical workers, caregivers, and staff members have reported some of the strangest experiences of their lives. So today we're going to move between real locations and personal style accounts. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Let's start with one of the most famous haunted hospitals in the United States. Waverly Hills Sanatorium sits in Louisville, Kentucky, and today it is one of the most well-known haunted medical buildings in America. Its own official site describes it as a former sanatorium in the Waverly Hills neighborhood of Louisville, and it now offers historical and paranormal tours to the public. Before it became a place associated with ghost hunts and paranormal investigations, Waverly Hills was connected to something very real and very frightening: tuberculosis. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was one of the most feared diseases in America. Before antibiotics, treatment often involved isolation, fresh air, rest, and specialized sanatoriums built away from crowded city centers. According to the Kentucky Historic Institution's archive, Louisville had one of the highest tuberculosis death rates in the country and at the beginning of the 20th century. A board of tuberculosis hospitals was established in 1906 to search for a proper location for a facility. Waverly Hills was not built to be creepy. It was built because people were sick, families were desperate, and doctors were trying to fight a disease they didn't have the tools to cure the way we can today. That's what makes the ghost stories attached to Waverly Hills feel so heavy. This was not just a hospital. It was a place where people were separated from their families, where patients waited, sometimes for months or years, and where staff saw death regularly. Over the years, Waverly Hills has become famous for stories of shadow figures, disembodied voices, footsteps, apparitions, and unexplained movement in the building. One of the most enduring legends connected to Waverly Hills is the so-called body chute, or tunnel, often described in paranormal circles as a passageway associated with removing the dead from the building. Some versions of the legend are probably exaggerated, but the broader point remains. Waverly Hills became associated not only with illness and isolation, but with death on a large scale. When a building carries so much suffering, it's not hard to understand why people believe that something stayed behind. Imagine walking through a former tuberculosis hospital at night. The beds are gone, the patients are gone, there is no staff, but the hallway still stretches out in front of you. The rooms open into darkness, and somewhere in the distance, you hear a sound, footsteps, slow and measured, coming from a floor where no one is supposed to be. That's the kind of haunting that Waverly Hills is known for. Not jump scares, but atmosphere and weight. The feeling that the building remembers. And that brings us to our first listener-style story. Because while most people will never spend a night inside of a famous haunted hospital like Waverly Hills, thousands of medical workers have experienced their own unexplained moments in much smaller places. Our first listener story is called The Call Light in Room 214, and this comes from Sarah, who said she worked as a CNA at a long-term care facility for years. She told me there was one room on her hall that everyone hated, room 214. And according to her, it was not because anything dramatic happened every night. It was worse than that because it was always small things. The bathroom door would open even though she knew she had closed it. The privacy curtain would move when the air was not running. Sometimes she would hear someone cough from inside the room, only to check and find that the resident was sound asleep. At first, she brushed it off. Because long-term care facilities make noise, buildings settle, residents call out in their sleep, staff members are tired, and there's always a rational explanation if you want one badly enough. But then the resident in room 214 passed away. The room was cleaned, the bed was stripped, and her belongings were packed up for the family. And for a few nights, the room sat empty. That's when the call light started. The first time it happened, Sarah assumed that someone had accidentally triggered it while cleaning. So she walked down the hall, opened the door, stepped inside, and the room was dark except for the light from the hallway. The bed was made, the bathroom was empty, and the call cord was hanging exactly where it should have been. So she turned off the light, checked the room one more time, and went back to the nurse's station. 10 minutes later, it went off again. Same room, room 214. This time, another aide looked up and said, "Isn't that room empty?" Sarah said yes, but she walked back down to check anyway. Again, the room was empty, bed was untouched, and nothing looked wrong. She turned off the call light and stood there for a second staring at the cord, when from behind her, she heard a woman's voice say, "Can you help me sit up?" And she froze because the voice had not come from the hallway. It had come from inside the room, from behind her. She stood there and could not move, just stood there with one hand on the call light, trying to convince herself that sound travels strangely at night, because she knew there was no one there. She left the room, went back to the nurse's station, and when she told the nurse on duty what happened, the nurse didn't laugh, she didn't roll her eyes, she just looked tired and said she always asked for help sitting up. And that's the part that makes this story stick. Because if something was in that room, it was not trying to scare anyone. It was asking for the same help it had asked for in life. Call lights are one of the most common stories you hear from haunted hospitals and nursing homes. But another common story is a figure in the hall. Someone seen for just a moment before they vanish. That brings us to our second real location. A place that was not only an asylum, but also a poorhouse, infirmary, orphanage, and nursing home. Rolling Hills Asylum is located in East Bethany, New York. According to its official website, the property originally opened in 1827 as the Genesee County Poorhouse. That phrase, poorhouse, carries a lot of history. Poorhouses were institutions created to house people who had nowhere else to go. The poor, the elderly, widows, orphans, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, and others society had pushed to the margins. The Haunted History Trail of New York describes Rolling Hills as a site that began as the Genesee County Poorhouse and later evolved through several roles. It notes that the property housed vulnerable residents, that an infirmary was added in 1938, and that in 1964 the property became the Genesee County Nursing Home before closing as a county facility in 1974. The paranormal claims attached to this location are exactly the kind of claims you would expect from a place with that much layered human suffering. The claims are voices, shadows, footsteps, and the feeling that the building is still occupied. A massive old institution with long hallways, rooms that held people who were sick, poor, elderly, abandoned, or forgotten. And here's the thing about places like Rolling Hills. The haunting stories are scary, yes, but the history underneath them is worse. Because a lot of the people who lived in institutions like this were not monsters. They were not villains or characters in a ghost story. They were simply people that didn't fit anywhere else. These were people without money, without family, or were too old, too ill, or too disabled, or too inconvenient for the world outside. So when people report voices or shadows in a place like Rolling Hills, there is a different kind of sadness to it. It raises the question, are these hauntings caused by fear or loneliness? Or is it possible that some places are not haunted because someone died there, but because someone was forgotten there? That brings us to our next listener story. Story number 2, the woman who checked the rooms. This story comes from someone who wishes to remain anonymous and worked night shift at a nursing home. She said there was a woman that the staff would see sometimes, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning. The woman appeared elderly. She wore a pale robe or nightgown, and she moved slowly down one particular hallway. At first, new staff always assumed she was a resident. They would see her pass the nurse's station and immediately get up because in a nursing home, a resident wandering at night can be dangerous. They could fall, get confused, or enter someone else's room, so the staff would hurry after her. But every time they turned the corner, she would be gone. Not like down the hallway gone, but literally gone. This listener said that the strangest part was that the woman was usually seen standing outside doorways, never inside the rooms, but always just outside. And the older staff knew the stories. They told new employees not to panic if they saw her. They said she had been a resident years before. Some claimed she had always worried about the other residents when she was alive, and if someone was sick, she would ask the aides if they had checked on them. If someone was upset, she'd want to know if they were okay. And after she died, staff started seeing her in the hallway, always on the night shift and always near the doors of residents who were declining. One night, a newer employee saw the woman standing outside the room of a resident who had been very ill for several days. The staff member stopped and said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman turned her head, and this employee said she could see her face clearly. But when the woman turned back toward the room, she disappeared. The employee ran to the nurse's station and told the nurse what she had seen. That's when the nurse went quiet and asked her, "Which room?" When the employee told her, the nurse said, "That resident probably won't make it through the night." And according to the listener, she didn't. The resident passed away just before morning. After that, the employees started paying attention. And over the next year, she saw the woman 2 more times. Both times, she was standing outside the door of a resident who passed shortly after. So far, we've talked about places where illness, care, and death were part of the building's daily rhythm. But not all haunted hospital stories come from places that are still operating or preserved for tours. Some come from hospitals that were abandoned. And there is something unique about an abandoned hospital. Because even empty, it still looks like the place is waiting for patients, staff, or the next emergency. And that brings us to our next real-life location. Linda Vista Community Hospital in Los Angeles is one of the better-known haunted hospital locations in California. The site has a layered history. It opened in 1905 as the Santa Fe Coastlines Hospital, originally serving workers of the Santa Fe Railroad Company, according to Working Nurse. Later, it became known as the Vista Community Hospital. Over time, the hospital developed a reputation for being haunted, especially after it closed and became a popular filming location. One of the interesting things about Linda Vista is that even articles about the haunting sometimes ask whether the hospital was truly haunted or whether Hollywood helped create the reputation. Working Nurse specifically raises that question, noting the tension between the hospital's real history and the way decades of film and television use may have amplified its spooky image. And that's a fair question, because abandoned hospitals already look haunted. You don't have to add much for the human brain to start creating ghosts. But that does not mean every story is fake. Linda Vista became associated with reports of apparitions, phantom footsteps, and figures seen in hallways. On one ghost tour, they described the stories of a child in a surgical room, a young woman pacing down the halls, and an orderly still making rounds. And whether the haunted reputation came from real experiences, urban legend, film crews, or some combination of all of it, Linda Vista became a perfect haunted hospital story because it fits the image people already have in their minds. And that brings us to our next story, because this one is not about an abandoned hospital, it's about an end-of-life experience. And it asks a different kind of question. What if some of the people seen in hospital rooms are not trapped there? What if they are visitors? Listener story number 3 is called My Mother is Here. And this story comes from Stephanie, whose grandmother spent her final weeks in a nursing home. The listener said her grandmother had been declining for a while. Some days she was lucid, other days she drifted in and out. The family was taking turns sitting with her, and Stephanie came in the evenings after work. She said the room always felt peaceful, but heavy in a way that no one could really describe. One evening, she walked in and found her grandmother awake. Not just awake, but alert and with it. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room near the window. She said, "Grandma, are you okay?" Her grandmother smiled and told her, "My mother is here." So Stephanie looked toward the corner and there is no one there. So she assumed maybe her grandmother was dreaming or confused. So she said, "You mean your mom?" And the grandmother nodded. "She's been waiting," she said. Now, Stephanie said that her grandmother sounded completely calm and also completely certain. A few minutes later, her grandmother lifted her hand slightly like she was reaching for someone. Then she said, "I told you she would come." Stephanie asked, "Come for what?" Her grandmother looked at Stephanie and said, "For me." The next morning, the family got the call that her grandmother had passed. Now, some people will hear that story and say that it was obviously confusion or a hallucination, or maybe the brain just doing strange things near death. And medically, that is possible. People near the end of life can experience visions or changes in awareness. But this moment did not feel random. She was seeing someone she loved. Which makes me wonder if some hospital and nursing home stories are not about spirits trapped in a building. Maybe some of the spirits are arriving there, coming to the bedside, standing in a corner, waiting near a door, brain trying to make meaning out of death. And sometimes they are probably right, but not every time. Maybe hospitals and nursing homes feel haunted because they are places of pain. But maybe they also feel haunted because they are places of love. For every person who dies there, someone cared for them. And if anything is strong enough to linger after death, it's that. And that brings us to the end of this episode of The Spooky Files. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, follow me on social media, leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you would like me to share on the podcast, you can send me an email to thespookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or fill out the contact us form on thespookyfilespodcast.com. I read every single email or message, and helps us build a community of people that don't just love a spooky story, but are looking for a safe place to talk about all of the things we don't always admit out loud. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out my other podcast, Hoosier Myths and Legends, where my sister and I share all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep it spooky, my friends.